Hello and welcome to Love Muslims Critique Islam, Part 6, The Real Truth About the Birth of Islam. Throughout this series of videos, I'll be sharing with you the truth of Islam that you won't get from the mainstream media and you won't get from Muslims. So let me reveal to you the secrets Imams don't want you to know and take you on a journey of absolute truth. Now, little about Islam makes sense, and looking at the Islamic timeline of events makes things worse and more confusing. The birth timetable of Islam doesn't fit the facts, and an examination of these facts only serve to compound its falsehood. The first reference to Muhammad, the most important man in the Islamic world, doesn't appear until 691 AD, which is 59 years after his death, and the first reference to Mecca, the most important city in the Islamic world, doesn't appear until 741 AD, which is 109 years after his death. And the first reference to any biography material of Muhammad is from 765 AD, which unfortunately we don't have today. And the first biography of Muhammad within the Islamic sources does not appear until 833 AD, and that was written by Ibrahim Hisham. The trouble is, Ibrahim Hisham lived in Iraq, which is about 600 to 800 miles away from where Muhammad lived in Mecca, and he lived 200 years after. The sayings of Muhammad, they came, 240 years later, written by al-Bukhari. The first historical commentaries come from the 10th century, and they were compiled by al-Tabari, who was a Persian historian where Iraq is today. And so all of this is written at the wrong place and at the wrong time. When Jesus was crucified in 33 AD, Paul's letters to the early churches were written just about 15 to 31 years after that event, when details were still fresh in the mind of the people that were with him at the time. And Paul wrote his letters around about 48 to 64 AD. So you can see the difference, can't you? Just 17 years after Jesus was put to death and raised again, we have first-hand eyewitness accounts of his life from Matthew and Mark, who are people who knew him, taught him, and walked with him. The Gospel called John came a few years later and was the last to be written down, though his letters were written about 30 to 40 years before that. Now, Islam's foundations are weak and questionable. Its bedrock is built on Arabian shifting sand and not on rock, as stories were verbally handed down from generation to generation. Well, we have a problem. What's that? Well, we've lost Mecca. See, Mecca is supposed to be the place where Muhammad was born, and consequently is the place for pilgrimage for millions of Muslims. It has a vital role to play in the Islamic story. But Mecca has only one mention in the Quran. The truth is that only up to recently, because of oil exploration, has Mecca become the large developed metropolis of any note, as for centuries before it was a mere backwater or a hamlet. From this map of Arabia from the 6th century, we can see Ethiopia, we can see the Indian Ocean, Pelagus, but we don't see Mecca. Mecca then was not the place of importance that we see today as the center of Islamic worship. Back in the 6th century, it has no strategic positioning for trade or for military purposes. By the time we reach the Middle Ages, Mecca still hasn't risen to any prominence and cannot be seen on this map from 1484, and as illustrated on this map of Arabia from the 18th century, the Arabs had still not held any importance to Mecca, as its elevated status today is a very modern invention. Muslims tell us that Mecca, according to Islam, is the center of his faith and indeed the center of history as well as the mother of all settlements. Muslims believe that Adam and Eve began life here on earth there when they fell to sin and were thrown out of the Garden of Eden. They also believe that in 1900 BC, Abraham was supposed to have lived there, and of course it's the birthplace of Muhammad. Though there's no evidence for this, but we do know he lived there after his first marriage. Three civilizations who had daily contact with Muhammad are mentioned in the Quran. The people of Ad are referenced 23 times, and they come from Petra in Jordan today, which is 60 miles north of where the people of Thamud came from, and they morphed into the people of the Nabateans, and they are referenced 24 times and come from Elah, or modern day Eilat, which is in Israel. Which is 250 miles north of where the Midianites come from, and they're referenced 7 times in the Quran, and they come from Tamar, which is in the Nafud desert. Now, all those civilizations are about 400 to 650 miles north of Mecca and are noted for their significance to pre-Islamic history, and they're all places mentioned on the pre-Islamic trade maps of the 6th and 7th centuries. Petra, Eilat and Tamar can be seen on this pre-Islamic Nabatean trade route map, and the first thing to notice is the absence of any sign of Mecca, as it was not a relevant trading hub and not on any trade route at the time, and it was then, at the time of Muhammad, just a place of insignificance. Out of all the places mentioned in the Quran, Mecca is only mentioned once. It's a hugely curious thing that Mecca is handed such a high gravity of relevance and significance in Islam. It is supposed to be the center of history, I mentioned that before, and where Muhammad, Muslims tell us, was born. Yet there are maps going back to Muhammad's time that don't even hint at its existence. Not surprising, as Mecca was nothing more than a backwater with little historical value. There are a lot of indications in Islamic text to another place, but not mentioning Mecca by name, that suggests it holds a greater priority with Islam, that Muslims point to as being Mecca, and it's called Mecca. And there are many descriptions of a place where, according to the Quran and other Islamic teachings, Muhammad is from, and that place is presumed to be Mecca, but the descriptions of this place in the Quran does not resemble Mecca. The clues in the text describe a place not matching the description of Mecca then or now. The geography and vegetation that the text speak of include parallel valleys, streams. Outside there are ruins and a pillar of salt. There are fields, trees. More interesting are the verses in the Quran that allude to a place fitting the description of Sodom and Gomorrah of the Old Testament, and mentioned Lot's wife as the pillar of salt when she turned into when escaping God's wrath when God destroyed those cities with fire and brimstone. But these are are now ruined cities and are over 730 miles north of Mecca, but only, curiously, only 50 miles north of Petra. And other descriptions give us olive trees, grass, fruit, and fertile clay soil. And none of these is in Mecca, nor is the description of mountains overlooking the Kaaba. So consequently, we've lost Mecca and we've lost Muhammad. If Mecca is of such historical Islamic notoriety, you would expect Muslims to fight to preserve it as a World Heritage Site. Every town or city of historical paramountcy attracts interest from around the world, and in particular when it's been redeveloped. A buzz of excitement goes round the world of archaeology, eager to dig around the excavations dug by the developers to find and preserve historical artifacts that might be there. Surprisingly, the development of Mecca is being allowed to happen at a rapid pace. For a place that is supposedly holds great importance for world heritage, and should be developed with care and sensitivity, and should be crawling with historians, unless in reality it doesn't. But nobody to date has found anything related to Muhammad's existence there yet, and they won't either. It could be the Saudi authorities want to hide this fact and disguise Mecca's lack of historical importance by pressing ahead on its drastic makeover and covering the evidence of the lack of evidence. Now, the picture there shows Mecca's ongoing development. And as you can see from the cranes in the foreground, in the center is the Kaaba, and just behind that is the world's largest clock face, designed to replicate and surpass Elizabeth Tower in London, commonly known as Big Ben. And also interesting, to the left of the center is what is supposed to be the birthplace of Muhammad. And where is it now? A building that should be of the highest preeminence and historical supremacy is being demolished and replaced by developers. As we can see from this model plan of the development drawn up by the architects. So, well, if not Mecca, then where? Right. Every mosque must have a direction of prayer called a Qibla. The Qibla tells the worshipper which direction to pray in. Okay, so every mosque doesn't need to face Mecca, but every Qibla within it does. So it's very important. So you go into a mosque and you see the Qibla and you say, well, over there's the Qibla, so there is that's facing towards Mecca, so I'm going to pray towards that, right? Okay, so it's very important for Muslims. It's so important that when they're traveling, they always have to have be aware of the direction of Mecca in which to pray. Okay, so every Qibla is facing Mecca, right? Wrong. Dan Gibson studied all the mosques around the world and noted their Qibla direction for his book, Early Islamic Qiblas. It's a great book. I thoroughly recommend it. Now, he found in his research that not every Qibla did face Mecca. In fact, the first mosque built up until 706 AD faced Petra and other directions. The Dome of the Rock, its Qibla is facing Petra. There's a great famous mosque in Cordoba, Spain. I love Spain, it's brilliant. Its mosque is actually facing a parallel direction between Petra and Mecca. And mosques in Africa, they would have their Qiblas facing in all sorts of different directions. Sometimes they would bisect the position between Petra and Mecca and have their Qiblas facing that way, almost like in defiance, a tribal defiance, because It's all about tribal allegiance at the time that the mosque was built. So why Petra? Well, Petra is was an Nabatean spiritual capital, and was a focal point for pilgrimage. Its spiritual influence reached across its trade routes, and every Nabatean temple would face towards Petra, as did the Qiblas of the early mosques when Islam was first evolving. Nabateans, they're people who were a tribal conglomerate whose empire stretched from what we would call today North Saudi Arabia, through Jordan, Israel, and up to Syria. They were well-established traders and had the trade routes that would go as far as China and India, using road and sea. The descriptions of Nabatean places mentioned in the Quran, they best fit today's places of Sabata, for example, which is in the west of Petra, and the biblical Sodom and Gomorrah, which is north, and Mount Sinai, which is to the south. You see, none of these descriptions of the places where Muhammad is supposed to have hailed from, according to their texts, match the descriptions of Mecca and Medina. They more match the places I just mentioned. So Petra, which is in Jordan, see, it fits the geographical descriptions in Islamic texts almost perfectly, and they had at the time the vegetation to match. So Petra is served by a stream, and recently archaeologists have discovered cisterns and dams and water storage facilities to create an oasis, which would facilitate the type of vegetation described in the Quran as to where Muhammad come from. And descriptions such as this that we find partly in Surah 774, and remember when he made you successors after the ad and settled you in the land, and you take for yourselves palaces from its plains and carve from the mountains homes, and you can see that that's what we get in Petra, a place that has tall mountains overlooking the Kaaba, and that's another description in Islamic texts. At its peak, it was a vibrant, self-sufficient trade hub, and it was about 50 miles from the ruined cities of Sodom and Gomorrah mentioned in the Bible. Remember those? That's where Lot's wife turned into a pillar of salt. You can see her in the picture there. Is that really her? Oh, I don't know. You tell me. But nevertheless, look, altogether, it's a closer match to the Islamic description of Muhammad's birthplace than Mecca. And you know, Nabatean culture does lend itself to Islamic culture. So it looks like we found Muhammad. Hooray! 600 miles away from where Muslims tell us he should be, but never mind, we found him anyway. And I hope you have enjoyed this 6th episode, The Truth About the Birth of Islam. In the next episode, I will be revealing more truths of how Islam really started. So please subscribe to this channel for some more surprising truths of Islam that you just won't get from the mainstream media, and you will hear it first on this channel. For the meantime, I'll say bye for now.